Summer 1943. Camp Crossville, Tennessee. The heat was a physical weight, thick and wet, a suffocating blanket so different from the dry, searing furnace of the North African desert he had left. The German soldier, a veteran of Rommel's time's Afrikakorps Asterisk, stood in the dust of the prison camp, mesmerized. In his hand was a curved glass bottle, beaded with condensation. The liquid inside was dark brown, almost black, and it was alive. Tiny bubbles rose in a frantic, continuous stream. He had never seen anything like it. After 2 years of fighting, of subsisting on sand-blasted hard biscuits, and the bitter roasted barley brew they called times Ersatzkaffee asterisk, this sweet, carbonated drink represented an impossibility made real. It was called Coca-Cola. The camp canteen, a simple wooden shack, sold it for 5 cents. The American guards, young men his own age, had told him this with a shrug. It was the same price, they said, that American children paid with their allowances. Across the vast, isolated network of American prison camps that summer, 371,683 German prisoners of war would begin to confront a reality that systematically contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had ever told them. They had been warned of American weakness, of a decadent, chaotic society that would crumble under pressure. They had been prepared for brutality, for starvation, for the harsh treatment due to a defeated enemy. They discovered instead a nation where ice cream was a routine dessert, where soft drinks were an everyday beverage, where candy bars were so common, so times abundant asterisk, that guards gave them away, tossed them to prisoners with a casualness that was profoundly shocking. These simple foods, these treats that most German children had never tasted, not even in peacetime, would systematically demolish the foundations of Nazi ideology more effectively than any re-education program. This was not a war of ideas. It was a war of production. The mathematics of abundance were being written in sugar and carbonation, in chocolate and ice cream. And these numbers, tasted on the tongue, revealed an American industrial capacity so vast, so overwhelming, that it rendered German deprivation not as a noble sacrifice, but as a needless, pointless, and tragic suffering. What began as simple, childlike amazement at American confections would evolve, over months and years, into a complete and total psychological transformation. They had not just lost a battle, they were beginning to understand they had lost their entire idea of the world. 16 items of a luxury that was, back in Germany, beyond the reach of generals or party officials. 16 items of pure, democratic, capitalist abundance. Coca-Cola became the symbol. It was the central icon of this new, baffling world. The Coca-Cola company's wartime production had reached levels that were, themselves, a feat of logistics. Company records show 5 billion times bottles were produced in 1943 alone. The company's contract with the military, pushed by its president Robert Woodruff, was a stroke of marketing genius that became a core part of the American war effort. The guarantee was simple. A 5-cent Coca-Cola would be available to every American serviceman, anywhere in the world. It was a commitment that required the construction of 64 bottling plants overseas, a logistical operation that mirrored the military's own, and the German prisoners discovered that this soft drink, unknown to most of them before their capture, was ubiquitous. It was not a luxury. It was a time staple asterisk. Every camp received regular, massive deliveries, work details, leaving the camps to labor on farms or in factories, observed vending machines and coolers, times everywhere, asterisk, gas stations, factories, small-town drugstores, schools. Americans of all ages, all classes, drank it casually, constantly. They would drink half a bottle and discard it, an act of waste that left the Germans speechless. What astounded the technically minded prisoners, the engineers, the mechanics, was the times standardization asterisk. The Coca-Cola they drank in Tennessee tasted exactly times the same as the one they might be given in Texas or in Maine. This was a feat of industrial quality control that exceeded anything German industry, for all its supposed precision, had achieved with consumer goods. The syrup, the concentrate, manufactured in Atlanta and distributed nationwide to a network of local bottling plants, represented a level of industrial coordination that shattered Nazi assumptions about American chaos. This was a system, a vast, complex, and perfectly efficient system. and it was dedicated to a soft drink. Historical records from the Coca-Cola Company archives confirm the scale. Many prison camps received weekly deliveries of 200 to 300 cases. Each case held 24 bottles. Camp Hearn in Texas, a large camp for Times Afrikakorps Times veterans, alone consumed approximately 7,000 bottles of Coca-Cola, Times weekly times during the hot summer of 1943. The prisoners were, quite literally, drinking the evidence of America's industrial might. And then there was the ice cream. The American military considered ice cream times essential times for morale. It was so important that specialized ice cream ships, concrete barges with massive freezers, were built specifically for the Pacific Fleet to deliver the frozen dessert to troops on remote islands. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, the 4th of July celebration in 1943 was a key moment. Prisoners watched as the American guards brought out hand-cranked freezers. They produced on-site gallons and gallons of ice cream. The end in the desert had been swift, total, and humiliating. The surrender of the Times, Heeresgruppe Afrika Times in Tunisia, during May of 1943, brought approximately 250,000 German and Italian soldiers into Allied captivity. These were veteran fighters, the hardened survivors of El Alamein, of Kasserine Pass. They were Rommel's elite, men who had pushed the British Empire to the brink of collapse in Egypt. They expected the worst. Nazi propaganda had been explicit. The Americans were gangsters, undisciplined, cruel. They were a mongrel race, incapable of professional soldiering, and they would treat their prisoners with sadistic contempt. Starvation was a certainty. Instead, within hours of their surrender, they encountered the American K-ration. These small, wax-coated cardboard boxes, which American GIs routinely complained about, trading their contents and discarding what they disliked, were, to the surrendered Germans, a feast. They opened them with suspicion, then with wonder. Inside, crackers, processed cheese in a tiny can, a fruit bar, impossibly sweet, sugar tablets, 4 cigarettes, instant coffee that tasted like coffee, and a small, dense bar of chocolate. German soldiers who had been surviving on minimal, often spoiled rations for months, who had forgotten the taste of real food, treated these emergency field meals as banquets. The confusion only deepened. At the processing camps established in the ruins of North Africa, the US Army began feeding them, systematically, efficiently. Military records show the menus: pancakes with syrup, fresh eggs, milk. These were foods that had vanished from German military rations years earlier, foods reserved for the highest echelons of the Nazi Party. The systematic, almost bureaucratic feeding of defeated enemies with food superior to their own army's rations began immediately. Its psychological impact, though not yet fully understood by the Allies, was profound. A German officer, captured in Tunis, later testified to the International Red Cross. His words freighted with the shock of that moment. "We expected to be starved as prisoners. We were prepared for it. Instead, the Americans fed us better than our own army had. This," he said, "this confusion about American resources began our education. That education became intensive on the journey west. The prisoners were loaded onto Liberty ships, bound for the United States. The ships themselves were the first lesson. They were not elegant vessels. They were rough, functional, and built with terrifying speed. The prisoners learned from the crews that these ships were being mass-produced at an unprecedented rate. But here was the evidence, floating beneath their feet. America was building ships faster than Germany could ever hope to sink them. They were being transported across the Atlantic in the very proof of their nation's strategic failure, and on these ships they were fed. Naval records show that prisoner rations were mandated to match or exceed standard crew provisions. Approximately 3,500 calories daily. Fresh bread baked in the ship's galleys. Meat, stewed or roasted. Canned vegetables. And coffee. Real coffee, served with real sugar and milk. Documented accounts from multiple crossings confirm it. Ice cream. The USS Times General M.B. Stuart Asterisk's log, from its July 1943 crossing, records the event with bureaucratic simplicity. On July 4th, American Independence Day, The ship's crew served ice cream to all German prisoners of war. The ship's own ice cream maker, a machine that produced 10 gallons per batch, worked all day. For men who had not seen ice cream since before the war, who associated it with peacetime, with childhood, with a life that was now lost, to be given a frozen dessert in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, in the midst of a total war. By their enemies, it defied understanding. It was absurd. It was decadent. And it was a terrifying demonstration of power. What kind of nation celebrated its own founding by wasting precious cream, sugar, and refrigeration on its captured enemies? When the ships docked at ports like Norfolk, Virginia, and Newport News, the prisoners encountered an America that Nazi propaganda had declared impossible. They had been told America was crumbling, starving, crippled by the war. They stepped off the gangplanks into a whirlwind of activity. The Norfolk Naval Base, covering 4,300 acres, its waterfront bristling with cranes and workshops, handled more cargo times, daily times, than major German ports like Hamburg managed in a times week asterisk. Trucks, thousands of them, moved in endless convoys. Trains, hundreds of cars long, shuttled goods from a continent that seemed to be one single massive factory. At the port exchanges, the small shops for dock workers and sailors, the prisoners glimpsed the truth. They saw shelves, piled high, not with necessities, but with times, luxuries, asterisk, candy bars. Shelves buckling under the weight of them. Brands they had never heard of, displayed in colourful, extravagant packaging. Hershey, Mars, Nestle. Military procurement records from 1943 show these exchanges stocked dozens of different varieties of candy. They sold them at a standard fixed price, 5 cents. The same price as the Coca-Cola. The same price charged across the entire continental United States. The journey inland, by train, provided the next lesson. They were not forced into the cattle cars used for mass transport in Europe, the very cars that were, at that same moment, carrying millions to their deaths. The German POWs travelled in passenger coaches. They sat on upholstered seats. Dining cars were attached. And in those dining cars they were served full, hot meals. Documented menus from a prisoner transport train in July 1943 show the dinner: fried chicken, mashed potatoes and gravy, green beans, a slice of pie, and coffee. The prisoners, talking to the guards, discovered this was not special treatment. This was standard American rail service. This was how times everyone times travelled. The prison camp system itself, a network of over 500 camps constructed with astonishing speed across the country, was the final revelation. They arrived at places like Camp Crossville in Tennessee, Camp Hearn in Texas, Camp Aliceville in Alabama. These were not the grim, barbed wire hells they had been promised. They were functional, clean, and built to a standard that exceeded Geneva Convention requirements. The barracks had electric lights. There were latrines with hot water and flush toilets. The barracks were heated in winter. These were comforts that many German civilians living in bombed-out cities no longer possessed. But it was the camp exchanges, the PX stores, that delivered the deepest and most profound psychological impact. These were the canteens, run by the U.S. Army, where prisoners could spend the money they earned. The pay was 80 cents per day for labor, later raised to $1. And with this money, this camp script, they could buy pieces of the American impossibility. According to Army Quartermaster records, the standard camp exchange stocked multiple brands of soft drinks: Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, Dr. Pepper, RC Cola, various candy bars and confections, ice cream, where refrigeration permitted, cigarettes and tobacco, fresh fruit and snacks, and even beer, a 2% alcohol content beer, available for purchase. A prisoner, after a day's work, could take his 80-cent wage and make a choice. With candy bars and cokes at 5 cents each, a single day's wage could purchase 16 items.